Hello, everybody. Today we are doing an MFA portfolio critique looking at work by Andrea Arts. If you would like to grow as an artist and you can't afford an art class, we've got everything you need here at Art Prof: critiques, tutorials, and professional development. Now, Andrea has a BA in studio art from the College of Worcester and recently completed a post-baccalaureate program at the Kalamazoo Institute of Arts. And the degree that Andrea has is from a liberal arts college with a fairly small art department. And so she didn't have a huge amount of resources when she got started in studio art. And her hope is to go to an MFA program that focuses on interdisciplinary programs. And so, looking at the entire portfolio at a glance, I think it's very clear that materials are so important in your work, Andrea. And you've got a broad range of materials. You have textiles, the secondhand yarn, the ceramics. There's a piece in the lower right that has insulation foam. And so clearly you're somebody who really, I think, as an artist, is after a very tactile experience. And I think right now, what's working really well for you is that you are trying out so many different types of images. You're creating objects, you're making pieces that could be interpreted as installations. You've also got the functional pieces with the teacups. And so that's terrific that you're not limiting yourself to a particular area of focus. But I do think there's a way for you to push your engagement with the material a lot further. And in general, what I really want to see is for the materials to have a deeper physical interaction with each other so they don't feel so isolated. So, for example, one of the pieces that really stands out to me in the portfolio is actually this piece, which is created with ceramic stoneware, insulation foam, and acrylic paint. And this is one of the few pieces in the portfolio where I really don't know what materials have been used until I read the text description. And so there's a degree of mystery in terms of how this piece was made that I think is really effective and compelling. Because a lot of the other pieces really reveal themselves a lot more clearly. Like this one is clearly a ceramic piece. These are clearly socks. This one is made with hand spun yarn. So, in a lot of these other pieces, I think your use of the material, it's fine. But the thing is, I think this piece with the insulation foam, I look at this and I think, okay, this is not something I've seen before because there's a whole world of textile artists who are doing all kinds of things. And I think it is hard to stand out because there are specific techniques and practices that you can learn with yarn and wool that I think can be very compelling, but it's hard to do something that people haven't seen a million times. And that's what you're competing with. And same thing with ceramics. There's a well-established tradition of different types of techniques and glazing and hand building. And again, very hard to compete in that area. And so, what I would love to see you do in your portfolio is to try to mix together more these different areas so that when I look at your pieces, I don't know where one material begins and where another one ends, because that's what's happening in this piece. That there are areas where I think I know where the pink insulation foam is ending, but then it crawls somewhere else, and I'm not really sure exactly where it's going to go. So there's a degree of unpredictability here that I think is really wonderful. Another thing in this piece, too, is you're playing with negative space. And if you look at the middle of the sculpture, there's this like little pocket. There's even a little hole on the left-hand side. And I think what negative space does is it really allows your sculptures to breathe. Because I think when you have pieces that are more solid, I think what ends up happening is they feel very heavy. Like, for example, what would happen if this piece here made out of the secondhand yarn? What if this piece had a hole in it or several holes in it? How would that shift our perception of that form? Now, you also have these functional pieces, and that I think for a lot of people, when they look at this, they do associate the shape of a teacup. And then you also have these smaller cups towards the end. I think out of all the pieces in your portfolio, the ceramics to me is the weakest, because I think it's clear to me looking at your portfolio that text is definitely a big part of your practice. And I think the issue I have with the ceramic pieces is that they're heavily reliant on the text. So one way that I like to test in my head whether text and artwork is working is I say, well, what would happen if I took away the text in this piece? Would I have something left that would be substantial? And here, if I take away the text and the stars, there's not a lot there going on to keep me engaged in terms of the form of the piece. And I think that's the same case with this one as well, that really the text is the only thing that carries this piece, because when we take away the text, it's an ordinary teacup. I mean, it is a little unusual that it has the double handles, but it's not anything that I haven't seen before. And so I think you can keep working with ceramics. I'm not saying you should stop, but I think the direction that I want to see you go in is for the ceramics to not stand alone. Because I think the other issue that you're encountering right now is that when you work with certain media like textiles, like ceramics, I think the difficulty is that there are examples of very accomplished technique, people who can make an incredibly thin vase that's very tall on a potter's wheel. I mean, that takes years and years of training to be able to do that. And I think you want to be careful that people don't misinterpret the way you're creating these objects as sloppiness versus perhaps a more eccentric or more awkward means of articulating the form, but that feels intentional. And I think with this piece, it doesn't feel intentional. I think that the surface seems like I either want it to be really smooth or I want it to be very textured. And right now it's this awkward in between place where it's not really one or the other. And so it ends up coming across as somewhat indecisive. Now, in this piece, you've got the acrylic paint, which I think is really working for you. And so it could be that perhaps you step away from glazing temporarily, or you don't even have to use stoneware. I mean, you could totally do this with polymer clay or air dry clay. There's a lot of different options here. And so you could keep doing the ceramics, but right now, to me, the most potential is in this piece with the painted stoneware. And so I would definitely explore that. And then if I go back and I read your artist statement, and if those of you who are watching want to read it, it's in the YouTube video description below and also on artprof.org. There's clearly a lot of focus on materials and your relationship with the materials. And you talk about that impact on community and individual well-being. And when I read your artist statement, all I'm really getting is that you love your materials, you love engaging with the tactility of them, and that's wonderful. But beyond that, I'm not really sure what the work is really about. Because when you say individual and community well-being, that is so broad and vague that I don't really know what you're referencing. And so I would really suggest that you ask yourself the why. Why am I making these images? What is their reasoning for being here? Because I get little clues looking at the entire portfolio, but for me, it's a guessing game. I'm not even, I think, in the ballpark in a lot of these pieces because I have trouble making connections between them, like trying to figure out, okay, well, how does that relate to this? Right now, a lot of the connections that I make in your work are largely rooted in the exploration of the material. And I want something content-wise that connects them somehow. And so you talk about the connections that we have to a material, but I don't really know what you're talking about there. And I think it's a huge world that you can tap into, but you got to get more specific. And so I think I would ask yourself, okay, am I trying to make something that speaks about my experience so it becomes a personal narrative? Or is this a larger commentary on, for example, a bigger community or a larger culture, whatever it is that you're trying to say? Because when I read through your artist statement, I have a hard time figuring out exactly what it is you're targeting beyond just the engagement with the materials. Now, I do want to talk about the role of text, because the text, it's not in every single piece, but it is fairly prominent. And I think right now, the issue with the text is that the text is really what you're relying on to carry the piece. So, for example, in this one and in this one, if I take away the text, it's just a sweater. That's how I would see it. I wouldn't see anything beyond that. And I think that you got to be careful about text for that reason, that you can really fall into that trap of the text explaining the artwork for us. And I would prefer that not be the case, because I think the issue with text is that oftentimes people feel like they're being told what to think about the work. And in my opinion, a lot of the artworks that are impactful are the pieces that pique our curiosity. They get us thinking, but they don't give us the answers at the back of the textbook. They ask us to consider and explore and contemplate an idea, and that's great. But I think here, I find myself going to the text to try to explain what I think the form does not. And this one, for example, with all the question marks, I think this one is better because it's one punctuation mark. And so there's a consistency there. And what happens is I start comparing the punctuation marks. Like I say, okay, well, this one's bigger, this one's smaller, this one's stretched out a little bit more, this one's oriented. Whereas I think when you just write out the text, I just sit and I read. I don't really engage with the object very much. And so I would just reevaluate the text. I would ask yourself, do I really, really need it? Is it absolutely necessary? Because it's one of those things where more often than not, I think text commonly creates more problems for people than it solves. That's not always the case, but that is the tendency. And so I think that if you don't need the text, there's no reason that it has to be there. And so just ask yourself those questions, because I think oftentimes that's the issue with a lot of portfolios, is that people haven't taken the time to ask themselves the why. Well, why do I have the text? Why does it have to be there? And sometimes you ask that question and you realize, you know what? I don't really need it there. It's really not that necessary. And I think I noticed as well throughout your portfolio, like this one says secondhand yarn. This one says secondhand and hand spun yarn. Why secondhand yarn? Like that is so specific. And it makes me wonder, why not brand new yarn? And so there must be a reason behind that. And I suspect that it's there, but maybe you need to make that more visible, because that's the type of thing I would not really know that just looking at the artwork. And so it could be something that you make more visible actually in the artwork itself. And then I think I would also think about your presentation, because there's a couple things in your photography that I think could be better. I think lighting could be a lot better. I can tell from this photo that you have multiple light sources, because there's shadows on both sides of the objects. And that can make it harder to read the form very clearly. And so I would really make sure that you have one very soft light source that's consistent. And then in a lot of these other ones, there's just a lot of dead space. I would go and I would just crop the top and the bottom area. And then I'm a little confused because these two pieces, they're similar. And yet this one has string that's been pulled across and it's clipped on with clothespins, but this one doesn't. This one floats. Maybe it has monofilament wire. I mean, it looks like it's holding, something is holding it up. I'm not sure what, and that's fine. I mean, I just don't even notice it. But the thing is, I wasn't sure if the clothespins were meant to be part of what you're trying to communicate, or if it's just, oh, well, this was what was around and that was how I was able to get it up. Because you also have this drapery in the back, and that is also verging on looking like poor craftsmanship. Like, I either want that to be like deliberately wrinkled fabric, or I want it to be like a perfect white wall. So be very decisive about that, because that's not the only piece you have it in. Like this one too, you've got the clothespins and the string. This one doesn't have it. This one does have it. And you have to say to yourself, well, listen, a clothespin, that has such a specific association. I think most people, the first thought is, oh, okay, hanging laundry outside to dry. But the thing is, do you want that association? If you don't, then your pieces should look more like this. Because I do find the clothespins, they did make me stop and think, is this part of the piece, or is this just presentation that hasn't been thought through all the way? Because there's a million ways you can hang your work. And I think you just want to ask yourself, like, do you want that clothespin to be part of the statement? Because right now it becomes part of the statement. It's impossible for me to not consider that as part of the piece. And then your backdrops, the color of the background in your 3D pieces, I would really stick with black, white, neutral gray. I think on a lot of these pieces where you have a blue background, it makes it harder for me to appreciate the white, because I think what happens is the white of the stoneware, it looks very dull compared to the blue. Whereas if you had maybe a dark gray background, maybe the stoneware would feel more luminous. So you got to watch out for that. I can see in this image it's a little bit dark. There's, again, a lot of space in the background. So that's a simple cropping thing. This one as well, the blue background, and the lighting's okay. I think it could be a little bit more dramatic, and then cropping as well. And you had another one, I think, had a little bit of a border showing. So I know it's very picky for me to mention stuff like that, but at the MFA level, that really does matter quite a bit. Okay, so let's go through and talk about the pieces individually. And this piece is beautifully made. I mean, craftsmanship wise, it really demonstrates your technical ability, but it does feel a little out of place to me within the portfolio. And that's fine. I mean, you're still working on your portfolio. It could be, oh, this is the piece I really want my work to go in, and that's fine. But right now, it is an outlier. I think it has a playful, whimsical quality. Part of that is the very bright, saturated colors, the very round forms. It actually makes me think a lot of the sculptor Ruth Asawa. She did these almost knitted wires, and they created these very voluptuous, very beautiful organic forms. So she may be an artist for you to look into. But I guess I want to see them interact more, because they feel like they're just put on the wall. And I wonder if these would be better if they were off the wall, that we could see how they interacted more. I guess that's the theme that I'm talking about here, is you've got a lot of good parts in your work, but the thing is, the relationships and dynamics between those parts are not very solid right now. It's like each one of these functions as its own figure. And I want to know, how do these different parts, how do they relate to each other? So these two pieces with the sweaters, I think these are some of the less interesting pieces to me, although I do like the text a lot better in this piece, because here the text is really clear. Like, I don't have any trouble reading it at all. This one makes me work a little harder. And I like that, because again, when you have text, it just like immediately reveals itself so quickly. It's like watching a movie where they explain the plot, and it's just boring at that point. But here, the fact that I have to work to see those words, I engage with it very differently. Whereas with this piece, I go in and I read, call me when you make it home, and then I'm done. I don't really stick around very much. And so this piece I like better, but I also think that beyond the words, I don't know what else I'm supposed to get out of the piece. So that's what I would consider, that you want the sweater, you don't want it to just be a surface. I think that you want it to engage more directly with the content. This piece, I think, is one of your weaker pieces. I think, again, because the technique, the making of this teapot, it's sort of mediocre. Like, it's not terrific, but it's also not bad either. But I think that mediocre leaves us feeling somewhat apathetic about the piece. I mean, it's really hard. I think today artists, you're competing against a lot of things. I mean, people have very short attention spans. They're so overly saturated with images through Instagram and looking at stuff online that it is very hard to get people to care about what you're doing. And I think here, once I read the text and realize I don't really know what it's talking about, then I'm sort of done with the piece and I'm ready to move on. Now, this piece is very lively and very dynamic, and it's so different in terms of the personality of it. Like that first piece, it was so pristine and well crafted, it's very tightly woven. Whereas this piece is almost the complete opposite end of the spectrum. I mean, it feels like very chaotic and almost scatterbrained in a way. And it's a piece that really has no idea what it's trying to do. But that's kind of what I love about it, is that it is so all over the place. In fact, I wish it had more of the frayed sections. I wish it was a little bit more dilapidated, because again, what you can do with negative space is get the piece to breathe a little bit more and to play more with the shape of it, because it still feels like an altered square. And I think that a lot of the pieces I like here are the pieces that do have unusual contours. And so here I would play with that more and see how you can really pull this piece apart. It feels a little bit dense right now, and I want it to breathe and expand a little bit more as far as negative space goes and the fraying of the yarn. So this one I really enjoy for the color scheme, because this is probably, I think, out of all the textile pieces, the most cohesive as far as a color palette goes. So for example, this first piece is very bright colors, and so it doesn't really have a color scheme. It's just very bright, but it has many, many different colors in it. I guess this one's complementary colors, the blue and the orange. This one, not quite so much. And this one is every color on the rainbow, which is sort of what I like about it. But this one has a very almost quiet, more laid back sensibility. It's very muted colors. You also have some of the texture, like the letter A and has a lot of pattern behind it. And so I think color wise, I'm intrigued because it seems like the colors you're picking, they're a lot more deliberate. They're not so random. Although I think this piece is fun. I love how crazy this piece is as far as being so many different colors. Like, this is so over the top that you have to go along with it. And so this piece is different sensibility. And so clearly what we're seeing in your portfolio is that you're capable of both. And so I think I would look at the work and ask yourself, like, hey, do I want to do every color of the rainbow? Or do I want something like this, which is a lot more focused? It also feels more natural because, I mean, I don't know anything about dyes or where they come from, but these colors are a lot more subtle. They're not as loud. And I think we do associate very, very bright colors, like especially fluorescence. We associate that as being a very manufactured look. Whereas I think we associate more natural materials as having a more muted, more earth toned color scheme. Now, whether that's actually the case, technically, I have no idea, but I think that's generally how your average person may interpret that. This, I think, is one of your weaker pieces. I don't get beyond, here are some socks, they're on a clothesline. They're also very evenly distributed. And so I'm not sure if that was on purpose or if it's just because the location wasn't really considered. I'm not really sure. It just feels like a very indecisive piece, and I feel sort of apathetic towards it. This piece, I think, like I said earlier, a lot of your ceramics pieces are, I think, less exciting compared to the other pieces you're doing. And I think with this piece, it comes down to feeling like it's two shapes that got just thrown together. And I want to know better, what is their connection? What is the transition? Because the transition is really in the middle where they come together. But the thing is, where they come together, like, it's not a joint, it's not something that's melting on something else, and yet they're also not separate. And so it doesn't feel like there was a lot of thought that went into the design of that transition. Or you could think about, okay, maybe one is pushing into the other, or maybe they're reaching out to each other, because there is something somewhat figurative about this piece. I think it's mostly the head-like form that's on the left-hand side. And then I think some of these loop forms almost feel like limbs. And so I think it is easy to look at this and think about it from a figurative point of view. But I just think form-wise, a lot of the transitions haven't really been considered. And then the glazing the surface isn't particularly exciting either. It's fairly monochromatic, like there isn't a lot of change in the surface. And so there's a level of predictability here that I think is not as exciting. This piece I'm very excited about. I think that it has a lot of potential, and I see how it relates actually to this piece. I mean, they look so different, but they both have these rings with the negative space. Like this one, I can see a little bit at the bottom left. I mean, I think it'd be very interesting if some of the rings got way bigger, because they're fairly small here, and they're also the exact same size. So if you play with scale and get those rings to interact more, maybe they even weave into each other. Maybe they interlock. I mean, who knows? You can think about that. But I do think you may want to think about color, as far as, do you really want the insulation foam to be separate from the acrylic paint, or do you want them to look like they're fused? There's no correct answer to that. You have to make a decision about where you want that to go. But I think there's a lot going on in here. This piece, I think, one of your weaker pieces. I think it feels more like a quick idea. I don't feel that there's the depth there as far as the concept goes, as far as your engagement with the materials. So this piece, I think, is one of your weaker pieces. So Andrea, I think that you've got a lot going for you here as far as your exploration of materials. And I'm so glad that the work is so diverse, because I think what I worry about is there is this pressure, I think, on a lot of artists to, oh, I need to find my style. I need to be more focused and more cohesive. And that is true to a degree when you apply for an MFA. You don't want your MFA portfolio to be some random smorgasbord of undergraduate assignments of, oh, nude figure posing and here's a still life. That's not what you want. But I think that you've got a very good sense of materials. I think what you have to start doing, though, you start to ask yourself those bigger questions. The why am I, you have to start figuring out what is your reasoning behind that. And that sounds easy, but it's not. It's hard. And I think for a lot of people, sitting down and doing that is very challenging. And so what you may want to do is go back, work on your artist statement. You'll probably have to do it multiple times, and start seeing if you can really put a finger on some of those ideas, get more specific, because that's going to help you not just write the statement better, but I think it's going to help you when you're actually making these pieces. So you start to make the work with more focus and more intention, because I think that's the largest concern, is you want to see a portfolio that feels like it has intent, that it's not, oh, some random work that I made, that you feel like you're really going somewhere with that. And I think that will really help improve your portfolio. Art Prof has a MFA Portfolios Premium Track, and you're going to work with myself and teaching artist Lauren Welch if you would like to purchase this premium track. For a lot of MFA candidates, there's not a lot of support out there, and it's hard to get the feedback that you really need to get an idea of where you need to go with your portfolio. And so the premium track, we have multiple lessons where we evaluate your portfolio, we help you work on your artist statement, and we also have portfolio critiques that you can purchase. Some people may not want to do the entire track. It is a bigger commitment, although it is more comprehensive. But if you are an MFA candidate and you have not had any feedback from a professional, somebody who's worked in academia before, we highly recommend this because it's very hard, I think, as an MFA candidate to work in a vacuum like that. And then I would actually suggest for a lot of people, do an artist call, because if you purchase an artist call, you may actually discover that maybe you don't need to do an MFA. I once did an artist call with somebody who was so convinced that they had to do an MFA. And by the time we were done talking and I had worked through with them a little bit better exactly what their goals were, what they were trying to achieve, we realized, oh, actually, this is not what I want. That's not what I thought an MFA was really going to be about. And so it turned out for that particular person that actually doing an artist residency was a much better fit. I mean, an MFA is a very significant financial commitment. And so for a lot of people, it's not a decision that you can make lightly. So if you're sort of wondering, oh, I'm not really sure this is the right fit, you may consider purchasing an artist call, and you can select whichever staff member you would like to speak to. And then we do have a very large MFA program section on artprof.org, which is our main site. So we have a lot of different streams asking, should you get an MFA in fine art? Other streams about how to prepare an MFA portfolio, or the specifics that you want to be looking for. And then we have many MFA portfolio critiques, sculpture, graphic design, painting, drawing, and printmaking that you can all check out. Art Prof has a podcast. It's available on Spotify and also on iTunes. And subscribe to our channel. Like this video, leave us a comment. Thank you to our top Patreon supporters. You are the ones who make it possible for us to have resources like this for free that everybody can access. So please help us hit our $6,000 Patreon goal. We are close. I can see the light at the end of the tunnel. Help us out, because when you support Art Prof, you're helping somebody in the world who can't afford an art class. That's ultimately where all of this goes. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.